Director General Carlos de Cossio, thank you so much for speaking with me this afternoon. President Miguel Díaz-Canel just gave an address before the UN General Assembly in which he denounced what he described as U.S. attempts to reinstate a Monroe Doctrine policy. This was a policy explicitly articulated by Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton when he famously declared Monroe Doctrine is back. Yet, is Biden actually continuing this policy?
The Biden administration has not said a word that we know about it. But in practical terms, what we see from the Biden government is a continuation of the Trump policy towards Cuba specifically, and to Latin America and the Caribbean in general. We don't see a major change, even though the rhetoric is not the same, and there's no official or explicit ratification of the Monroe Doctrine. But we don't see truly a real change. We have to understand that this Monroe Doctrine implies for the people and the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean an attempt to impose U.S. willingness over the sovereignty and self-determination of the rest of the nations of the hemisphere. And that's how it's understood, in spite of the fact that John Bolton, during the Trump administration, used to boast about it being back.
And can you define what the Monroe Doctrine policy is, specifically from the Cuban perspective?
President Biden, in his speech mentioned a few countries. I found that he forgot to mention the United States, and protest, social problems, injustice, lack of respect for human rights, abuse by the police in the United States, which, being the president of this country, it would be fair or would be expected for him to mention the United States, or for him to mention some of its allies around the world where you have very serious problems of this type. Now, in the case of Cuba specifically, we have to understand that the U.S. government and the U.S. political class, to a great extent, fails to understand and fails to accept that Cuba is and has the right to be a sovereign nation.
So how, as a diplomat, do you deal with a country which views you in this way? How is it working with the Biden administration so far? Do you have any idea whether or not it will return to the Obama-era policy of normalization with Cuba?
My job is to deal with the issue of the bilateral relationship with the United States and Cuba, which is a challenging task. We formally have diplomatic relations, even though exchange is to the minimum. We have an important amount of Cubans living in the United States. There are descendants of Cubans in the United States. We share a border. There's a part of Cuban territory occupied militarily by the government of the United States against the will of the Cuban people. We share an area of the world where there's drug trafficking, where there's criminal activity, where there's illegal actions of all types, where there are environmental problems, and yet there's very little communication between the two governments. We had a moment of increased cooperation, of increased engagement, recognizing that we had then differences and that we will continue to have them, which is normal between two nations. But we had cooperation. We had the possibility to engage in a civilized manner to discuss both about our differences, but also to discuss about those areas where we can identify common interests, where we believe that we can work together, both for the benefit of our respective countries, our respective people, but also for the benefit of the region. What explains that Cuba and the United States cannot cooperate, for example, in fighting COVID in our region, or in fighting crime in our region, or in fighting drug trafficking in our region? And the only reason is the lack of political willingness in the United States. There was a change in this understanding at the end of the Obama government. It seemed, when one looked at the electoral campaign in the United States, when one looked at what the government of then candidate Biden would do, that there was an intention to make a change. There hasn't been any. There has been an announcement of a revision, which very comfortably gives the government the impression, or it allows the government to give the impression that it is taking a distance from the Trump period, from the Trump government, but at the same time does nothing, implying that it is faithfully applying the same policy as the government of Trump did against Cuba. I'll give you an example. We haven't spoken with anyone in the administration, and we haven't spoken with any politician that can, with a straight face, tell us that Cuba is a country that sponsors terrorism. Nobody in the United States that has a little knowledge about our region and about Cuba can honestly say that Cuba is a state that sponsors terrorism. Nobody in the Obama administration believes so, and that's why it was changed. Trump was criticized when it made the attempts to do it before he did it. Then the Trump government included Cuba in the list that is published by the State Department that one would think would have been changed in a government with people that don't believe what that list implies in the case of Cuba. Yet no change has happened. Now, it's not only that we are concerned with slander against Cuba. It's not only that we are offended when we are accused of sponsoring terrorism. The problem is that that list has practical impacts. The overwhelming influence and weight of the United States around the world implies that in many parts of the world, Cuba runs into trouble trying to do business, trying to interact. Several banks from different countries around the world have refused to continue business with Cuba just because Cuba was put in that list. And they fear, even though they are in a different jurisdiction, under the sovereignty of another government, they fear that their interest, above all if they have interest in the United States, could be jeopardized if they continue to interact with Cuba. So it's not only symbolic, it's something that has a concrete impact that has consequences for the lives of millions of Cubans. Once you damage the Cuban economy, you impact the lives and the standard of living of millions of Cubans.
Some say that was actually a strategy employed by the Obama administration aimed at liberalizing Cuba and making it more ripe for U.S. influence to come in.
I won't question it. The government of Obama said so explicitly, so there's no point in me questioning it. And it's a challenge for us. Truly, greater engagement with the United States, greater communication, greater presence of American business in Cuba is a political challenge. It's an ideological challenge. But we believe that we need to engage with the rest of the world in that manner. It will have political implications, we know. We knew it then, and we know it now. But we believe that we should continue to engage peacefully with any countries in the world as we do with the rest of the world. It's only with the United States that it's the only government that has chosen to have this type of hostile relationship with Cuba.
And we saw the impact of that policy specifically this year when Cuba was hit with demonstrations, which the United States supported and exploited. We covered that in depth at the Grayzone, the connections between, for example, the San Isidro movement and the U.S. State Department, open connections with U.S. intelligence. So before we get into U.S. meddling in Cuba, I'm just wondering, do you think any of the grievances expressed by those protests were legitimate?
Yes, of course there were genuine grievances. It's a very hard time for Cuba, social economically, as it is in many parts of the world, as a result of COVID, as a result of the world international crisis, both of which have a huge impact in the Cuban economy, in the capacity of our economy to respond to the needs of the population. There are also grievances as a result of the impact of the economic blockade. You have to take into account that the U.S. government chose to identify COVID as an ally in its hostility towards Cuba. Instead of thinking, let's take this opportunity to express a humanitarian concern, to offer an exception with humanitarian concern, aid towards Cuba, it chose to believe that COVID would help the goals of the U.S. government during the Trump administration, but there has been no change with the Biden administration. So those realities were there. There are also people who are suffering blackouts, power shortages, which occur in Cuba because of problems of our grid, our infrastructure, but also because the U.S. government took a policy from mid-2019 to deprive Cuba from supplies of oil. These are the type of measure that you take under war conditions, when there's a war. There's no war between Cuba and the United States, and yet since 2019, the U.S. government has been sanctioning applying pressures against the exporters of oil, the producers of oil, the shipping companies, the insurers of the shipping companies, so that oil does not arrive to Cuba, or that is very costly for Cuba to acquire the fuel that we need for running our economy, for our services in general, including electricity. So we've had blackouts in the summer. If you live in a community, it is difficult to obtain your basic needs, including food, because you have to do queues. There's a scarcity of products. You have blackouts. There's lack of medicine in many of the drugstores because we don't have the raw material to produce the medicines and the drugs that you need, not for COVID, for chronic diseases that exist in Cuba. If, in addition to that, you have the heat and you have the difficult conditions of the country, it's natural for there to be genuine concerns. You also have people who disagree with the government. You have people who want to migrate to the United States, and you can't because the U.S. has shut down the migratory services in Havana. You have people who don't believe in socialism. There are people who believe that capitalism is their solution. There are people who believe that they want to move to the United States because they have a dream of becoming millionaires, and Cuba does not give them that opportunity of becoming millionaire or of improving their livelihoods and are unhappy in the way they are. And then you add to that what you mentioned, which is direct incentives from abroad, direct mobilization from abroad, the direct encouragement with the promise of payments for people to go out in the street. Then you have what you experienced on July 11th. And I need to clarify, we're not speaking of demonstrations during the summer. We're speaking of demonstrations on that day, on July 11th of this year. The majority of the population, of the people that went out in the street, many of which were in pictures around the world, came out in support of the government afterwards. Not to fight, not to coerce, but simply to be present in the street and to express support for the government, which was the major factor that implied that the demonstrations went down. The army didn't go down the street. You didn't see the military in the street, as you do in Latin America often, as you have the National Guard in the United States. That does not and did not occur in Cuba.
You even had fake images of protests in Egypt circulating, people claiming that that was Cuba.
And in Buenos Aires, and images of a pro-government rally in Cuba being portrayed as a rally against the government. And that was not by obscure media. This was by main media.
And some of what you just mentioned in terms of fuel shortages, for example, actually demonstrate how U.S. policy on Venezuela impacts Cubans, correct?
It's correct. If one looks at the excuses, and this is very interesting, if one looks at the excuses used by the Trump government to punish Cuba, they were all circling around Venezuela. It was the narrative, or the legend, that Cuba had over 20,000 troops in Venezuela that were coercing the Venezuelan army, that by the way is larger than the Cuban army, that were coercing the Venezuelan government. And that was the reason why U.S. policy of defeating the Maduro government and inventing this Guaido, whoever, president in Venezuela, was failing. So because of that, they started to apply on a monthly and sometimes on a weekly basis coercive measures against Cuba, in addition to the economic blockade. The whole narrative was based on that. That's the basis for which Title III of Helms-Burton was applied. That's the reason why they took measures to deprive us from oil. That's the reason why they shut down remittances to Cuba. And that's the main reason used to put us in the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. Now, the Biden government has not repeated that once. It has never said that its policy is linked to the so-called 20,000 troops, that nobody has ever found one in Venezuela. But yet it continues to faithfully apply the same policy. And that's what's so curious about the Biden government. Expressing and promising to elect to the electors in the United States a swift change of policy, and yet proclaiming a revision that implies never acting.
How did the decision to lock down, particularly lock down and shut down all tourism in Cuba, impact the political situation and the economy Because I'm sure that had a disproportionate effect on the poor.
We've had to shut down, because of COVID, many workplaces, in services, in education, administration, and in many areas. And as in every country, it depresses the economy. Restaurants, anything that implies social activity, and that has an impact on the economy. We had to shut down tourism, which is a main source of income for our country, and our country continues shut down by tourism, implying that the huge cost of isolating people, of hospitalizing each and everybody infected with COVID, giving them 3 meals a day, all at the cost of the government, 3 meals a day, supporting all the personnel that you had to mobilize for that, giving them, housing them, giving them 3 meals a day. All that's a huge cost, a huge burden on the economy at a moment where we have very, very limited sources of income. So for us to act is very difficult.
How did the fact that Cuba has been under a blockade for so long, essentially cut off from the international economy, uniquely position it to respond to COVID-19, particularly in terms of medical innovation and development of vaccines?
We had a very successful result in 2020 with a low level of infection and low levels of death. It is at the first quarter of this year that we, with the introduction of the Delta variant, that we started to have a more severe situation in the country. But from the beginning of the pandemic, we started to cooperate with other countries. We sent brigades to countries where they had worked in the past. Just in Latin America, we had brigades in Venezuela, but we had in Mexico, we had in Peru, we've had in several Caribbean countries, in Bolivia, and we had in Italy, we had in several African countries, and several Arab countries. So we've been able, I think it was around 40 countries where we sent brigades to help and to complement the effort of the respective government with COVID. But another important decision that we took was in March, before there was even one person infected in Cuba. Our president met with the scientific community. And Cuba has had a 40-year-long development in biotech and in pharmaceuticals with very important results, some of a unique nature. He met with them and he said, we need to postpone other priorities, make an extra effort to try to reach a vaccine. Because we might be able to cope with this in Cuba through the typical epidemiological defenses like wearing masks, distancing, washing your hands. But there might be a need to go beyond that because it's a new virus. It's a result of mutations. It could continue to mutate with new variants, and a vaccine would eventually be needed, if not only for Cuba, for the rest of the world. So we began very early to try this development. When the vaccine was announced in the United States, we already had 2 candidates in Cuba, proven at the laboratory level, but with very optimistic results that needed to be tested so that it could be applied. And we were in the process of doing that. With, of course, the resource limitations in Cuba, in not only in the capital established, but in the requirements that you need to escalate production. And in spite of that, we were able to advance. At this moment, we have 4 vaccines in Cuba that are being applied. 2 of them are the main ones that are covering the program for the country. We already have over 45% of the population vaccinated. We plan to end the month of November with 92% of the total population vaccinated, which includes children from the age of 2. We're the only country doing that. It's proving to be successful, not only in the statistics of the test, but it's already proving to be successful in having a drop in deaths and a drop in infections in the urban areas where there has been a greater application or people have been immunized with the vaccine. Some countries have asked to participate with our vaccine. Iran is one example. We've sold some of them, and now we're joined in production. Vietnam, we have sold to them some vaccine. We're planning to join too. And we've helped other countries, supplying vaccine countries in great need. And we're ready to do that. Our plan is to vaccinate our population and to be ready to engage with the rest of the world.
And what about the fact that in Europe, for example, where they've implemented the Green Pass, where you have to show proof of vaccination in order to enter restaurants or basically participate in public life, they don't actually recognize the Cuban vaccine as part of that system. Why is that?
I would like to think of it as not yet. It's true that the Cuban vaccines have not had yet a WHO recognition. It took us time because we wanted to be more severe, more thorough in the documentation, the statistical evidence, and the medical evidence, right? Because we knew Cuba was going to be challenged, because it's a developing country, because it's a small nation, because people want to be or are skeptical. So we wanted to be more thorough than others in putting forward the documentation. That process has already begun. We are confident that the WHO should be able to certify the Cuban vaccine, if for no other reason, by the results that we're having in Cuba, we're beginning to have already. So we want to believe that in European countries, in other parts, they will eventually accept the Cuban vaccine.
What would you like the U.S. audience to understand about the current state of U.S.-Cuba relations?
That Cuba has the right to choose its own path. That Cuba has the right to self-determination and to decide the type of society that we want. That we pose no threat to the United States. That we pose no animosity towards the United States. Of course, we reject the hostile policy of the government, but you cannot trace any sentiments of animosity among the Cuban people towards U.S. citizens, to Americans in general. Now, we don't ask of the United States for credits. We don't ask for preferential treatment. We don't ask for most favored nation in terms of trade. We don't ask for long-term loans in very preferential terms. We don't ask them to pardon any loan because we don't have any loan. What we ask of the United States is to allow us to live in peace, to allow us to be a nation, as a rightful nation that has gained its right to self-determination, to build its own future, to cooperate with the rest of the world. The United States, no one in the government of the United States can seriously say that Cuba poses any threat in terms of terrorism, in terms of organized crime, in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of alien smuggling, in terms of environment, in terms of diseases. On the contrary, Cuba, for whatever reason, we are like a beacon of security for the U.S. southeastern border. There's no threat to the United States coming from Cuba. Now, you won't listen to that, or you won't understand that when you listen or you hear the rhetoric coming out from politicians in South Florida and the people that have made careers and have made a living out of hostility toward Cuba. But if you just do a little checking, you don't have to go very far, you would understand that.
Well, one of the threats that we've heard has come from Cuba in recent years is the so-called Havana Syndrome and noise attacks against diplomats, U.S. diplomats living in Havana. Why do you think this narrative has been amplified by the United States? And what is the story behind it, really, from the perspective of your government?
The story is very difficult and the origin. One can suspect many reasons, but the true origin is difficult to determine. The truth is that up to today, there's no proof whatsoever, not one single evidence that an attack took place. Yet the government has a speaking of attacks. There's no evidence that the people that might have suffered some health systems suffered them because of the fact that they were in Cuba. In other words, there's no proof that if that same person would have been in any other place in the world, including the United States, they would not have felt those same symptoms. There's been no thorough investigation, made public at least, that previous conditions, pre-existing health conditions, did not have an influence in what happened. The FBI made an investigation and concluded that there was no proof of any wrongdoing by anyone. We made our own investigation and coincided it came to the same conclusions. We put perhaps the best team of experts that we have in Cuba in multiple disciplines to study, and they have defeated each and every one of the different theories I've come on. The one about sonic attack, similar to a cicadas.
Yeah.
They have defeated the ones about microwave, believing that you can send a microwave through a wall where there are 5 people, target one and not the rest. For a microwave energy to cause the kind of impact in the brain and in the ear that is being alleged, there would have to be at least burning scars in the person involved. Practically the head would go on fire. So a person cannot say that suddenly began to feel dizzy, that they had headaches, all of which is possible to have occurred, as a result that at some moment in which they couldn't find out which one it was, there was a strange sound and they received an ultrasound. Now, I'm not saying that the people who have the symptoms are portraying this, but the scientists that have spoken about this have been challenged in multiple occasions by authorized scientists in the US, in Europe, and in Cuba, and in scientific magazines and publications that have existed. There are already several publications on the case, and nobody. And we found that the US government has not given officially credit to any of these theories, but they have not rejected them either. We believe the US government is some sort of trap. At this moment, we don't know how they can come out of it, but I can assure you that no diplomat from any country has ever had any reason to feel threatened in Cuba. I can give you guarantee of that, and I am sure that the majority of US diplomats that have served in Cuba since 1977 have never felt reason to believe that they can be threatened in Cuba more than they can be threatened in any other part of the world, including many parts of the United States.
And finally, we discussed the demonstrations in Cuba earlier this year and the fact that the United States actually worked to amplify them. And one of the ways through which they did that was through producing this rap song and music video called Patria y Vida, which was sort of a reversal or a play, you could say, on the revolutionary slogan in Cuba, Patria or Muerte. What is the significance of that phrase for you as a Cuban?
It's a slogan very linked to our revolution. It's a cry of independence, like many countries have, and for Cuba, very sensitive to Cuba. It is the prevailing slogan in Cuba. This is a song that had a fact. The majority of Cubans don't pay much attention to it because it wasn't even unique. The first one to use the term Patria y Vida was Fidel Castro, speaking to children. He said Patria Muerte, but it's also Patria y Vida. That was Fidel Castro. I don't know. I'm sure that when the CIA and the different organizations in the US wanted to put together this song and paid for it, they didn't take the trouble to check everything that Fidel had said. And they would have wanted to be quoting Fidel Castro in a song.
Director General Carlos de Cossio, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.